It also goes well with your shoes, you know. I think maybe I'm the problem, the sound problem. I was wondering if I was the problem the whole time.
Well, don't leave.
Okay. Is it okay?
Better.
So, you said that it was a deeply moral book. I think that's what you said. I don't think of it as a moral book. I don't think of this as a moral issue. Actually, I think of it as a common sense issue. And to describe it as a moral issue is to lower the bar of morality to a point at which it means nothing. It is not moral not to steal from a store. It's not moral not to litter. It's not the moral choice to refrain from punching people that you're angry at. These are just basic human decencies. If everyone can't agree on these things, we're not going to have a functioning society. And we now have a farm system that is the #1 cause of global warming. It is, according to the United Nations, one of the top 2 or 3 causes of every significant environmental problem on the planet, locally and globally. Air pollution, water pollution, deforestation, loss of biodiversity. We know it's making our antibiotics less effective. We know we're treating animals in ways that would be illegal if they were dogs or cats. And we know it's terrible for our health. So these are things we all have to agree are bad. If we can't agree that those things are bad, it's very hard to imagine how we're going to have any kind of worthwhile civilization.
People agree those things are bad, but they don't factor those things in when they make the most basic decisions about what meals they're going to eat every day of their lives.
I don't think people have had, until pretty recently, access to the full picture. Most people know the gist. You know that farming there's a lot of factory farming, but we don't know exactly how much. And we know that it's bad for the environment and for animals. We don't really know how bad, just that these things are bad and we'd prefer not to think about them. This was my story until 3 years ago. But the breadth of factory farming surprises a lot of people to find out that it is effectively all that's available. It's more than 99% of the animals we eat come from factory farms. So if you're in a supermarket, the meat that's available is almost certainly factory farmed. If you're in a restaurant, the meat that's served to you is almost certainly factory farmed. I mean, as certainly as 99% can be. And the scale of the environmental destruction, do people know it's bad? Do they know that it's responsible for more greenhouse gas emissions than everything else put together? All transportation, all planes, boats, cars, light bulbs, refrigerators, whatever it is, add it all up and it's less. And the treatment of animals is something that also I think surprises a lot of people. It doesn't, maybe a good way to enter this is to say that I'm not really an animal person. I didn't approach this as an animal activist. The first stop I made was to a farm sanctuary in my research because I thought it would be useful to just interact with farm animals and see what they're like. And as it turned out, I didn't want to stay very long. I didn't like hanging out with farm animals. The guy kept saying, "Go ahead, you can pet it." And I said, "I don't really want to pet it. Look into its eyes. I don't really want to look into its eyes." And yet, there are things that we should not do to them. And 96% of Americans, and I have to imagine the number is probably higher, if anything, in Canada, say that animals should have protection, legal protection from cruelty. 76% of Americans say they'd be willing to pay more money to have meat that was brought to them by more ethical means in terms of the animal welfare. These are really astounding statistics. You can't find anything that 76, much less 96% of Americans agree on.
But if that's the case, if there's that level of agreement, why did you have to write a book in order to awaken these ideas in the people that you're trying to reach? Because clearly there is an aspect of this book that's a manifesto that's looking for change.
Well, why did it take me 20 years to become a vegetarian? Because it's difficult. Because, first of all, we've been told various stories about where meat comes from. When was the last time you saw a package of meat that had an image of a windowless shed on it? Never. The stories that we're told about where our food comes from encourage us to have this image of farming, which corresponded to farming 50 years ago, but doesn't correspond to farming anymore. And that kind of farming, most people are comfortable with. Most people find to be perfectly respectful, normal, and worth supporting. but it barely exists at all anymore. It's less than 1% of what's available. So we hold fast to that image. Even though we know that there is this other thing that exists, we cannot help but hold fast to that image. And the other thing is, food is complicated. You know, it is comfort food. It is breaking bread. It is our religion. It is what our mothers and fathers fed us and what our grandparents fed us.
Yeah.
And these things are not easy to get over. And I don't think they should be scoffed at or underestimated. They're very, very important. The question is, are they infinitely important? Is there anything that we care about more than those things? And the other thing we have to remember is the majority of our meals don't actually engage that deep cultural significance. So I was on a radio show with Anthony Bourdain recently, and he was saying, yeah, but vegetarians make terrible tourists. And I said, okay, how often are we tourists? You know, how often do we find ourselves in Papua New Guinea being offered like pig's testicles or whatever? You know, maybe some of us a week, 2 weeks a year. So eat that stuff when you're in Papua New Guinea for those 2 weeks a year, but don't make that your excuse for eating McDonald's when you're in Toronto. You know, because the truth is, factory farming developed because of very, very cheap meat. Because of meat that is particularly bad for us, particularly bad for the environment and animals, and frankly doesn't taste very good. So sometimes people will say to me, I agree with this argument that you're making, but there's the Christmas ham, but there's the Thanksgiving turkey, but there's my mutton. And I say, well, let's add up all of those things that really, really matter to you, all of those meals, you know, where it's like, where you legitimately can't quite imagine the absence of meat. How many meals is that in the course of a year? And you can even include things that aren't at that extreme, like going to a friend's house who's prepared a meal over the course of several hours and really wants to, whatever, welcome you into his home. If you add them all up, I think most people would find the number is not that big. It's certainly a very small minority of the meals that we eat. So then maybe we can start by just setting those aside and saying, if that's where meat really matters to us, we'll eat meat in those situations, but let's not eat it in the other situations. And I think that's the beginning of the answer. You know, we're used to framing this as a binary, like you're a vegetarian or you eat meat, as if those were the only two options. And most people, as it turns out, most people cannot imagine themselves becoming vegetarian. But we've ignored this huge middle ground, you know, where people can care and act on their care.
Yeah.
So, you know, if this group of people in the room became vegetarians, which is very wishful thinking, we would still have a huge factory farming problem. But if everyone from this side over started to engage with this problem and eat less meat, then we could really be making progress.